So we had the press conference, the kickoff press conference for Danny Jacobs versus Sergiy Derevyanchenko. I finally pronounced that surname with some degree of accuracy. I'm sure it's not 100%, but Derevyanchenko is what I'm going to stick with. So they had the kickoff press conference yesterday. Eddie Hearn also announced that he has signed Tevin Farmer, much to the horror and bewilderment of so many Deontay Wilder fanboys, because they can never understand why anybody would sign with Eddie Hearn. Maybe it's because he pays a hell of a lot more than most other promoters. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's because he's got a very good track record when it comes to putting on big shows in the UK. Maybe it's because he's got an enormous amount of money behind him when it comes to his DAZN platform. Maybe that's why. I don't know. Just putting it out there. Maybe it's also because he doesn't have a track record of being involved in legal battles with his fighters and former fighters. Maybe that's why people are tempted to sign with him. Danny Jacobs certainly has signed with Eddie Hearn. Again, much to the horror and the dismay and the bewilderment of all these Wilder fanboys. Oh, why would you sign with Hearn? He's terrible. Oh my God, how could you? These people are not rational. But we've been there before. Let's move on. Jacobs versus Derevyanchenko. Now, I've been looking at Derevyanchenko because I didn't really know much about him, to be honest with you, prior to this fight being made. I've heard about him, people saying he was good and what have you, but I hadn't seen too much of him in the ring. So over the past few days, I've been looking at Derevyanchenko fights. He's only 12-0, 10 knockouts, but he was a vastly experienced amateur. He's from Ukraine, 32 years old. His alias is the Technician, and I think that is a very fitting name for him, the Technician, because he is more of a technician than an out-and-out slugger or a puncher or anything like that. He can punch, but that's not what jumps out at you the first time you watch him fight. In fact, one of the first things that jumped out at me about Derevyanchenko is how relatively short he is. Now, Danny Jacobs is a tall middleweight. He's around 6'1", I believe. Derevyanchenko is noticeably shorter. Says he's listed at 5'9". I mean, look at the reach. 67.5-inch reach. That's a very short reach. Just to put it in perspective, welterweights like Kell Brook have got a longer reach than this. Amir Khan has got a longer reach than this. Floyd Mayweather's got a longer reach than this. So he's a short-armed 5'9" middleweight. But he is technical. Even though he's short-armed and relatively short in height for a middleweight, he's a technical guy. He can apply pressure, but he can also box on the back foot. He's just very, very well schooled and has a very polished style. If you look at his record, there's no spectacular names on there. Sam Solomon is a name that a lot of you may know. He did fight Sam Solomon. Solomon was way past his best, and Solomon's never been that good to begin with, to be honest with you, but he was a world champion at one stage. He stopped Solomon in the second round as a big left hook that eventually took Solomon out. He also fought Torreno Johnson. That fight he managed to win in the 12th round. Most of you will know Torreno Johnson. He's been around for a while as a middleweight contender. In his last fight, he fought Deshaun Johnson. I don't know who Deshaun Johnson is. The guy's got 22 losses, so it's no surprises. I don't know who he is. Now he's fighting Danny Jacobs. So this is going to be a very, very, very big step up for Derevyanchenko. Very big step up indeed. Danny Jacobs has been in there with Golovkin and Peter Quillen and all kinds of other people. So it's not a step up for Jacobs. Now, some of you may or may not know, so these are the fights of Derevyanchenko that I've been studying. Some of you may or may not know that Derevyanchenko and Danny Jacobs have actually sparred over 300 rounds together because they are essentially part of the same training camp. Derevyanchenko's trainer was, I think, the assistant trainer to Danny Jacobs over the years. So it's kind of a difficult situation for him having to pick sides and now exclusively train Derevyanchenko for this particular fight to beat Danny Jacobs. But because there's such intimate knowledge of each other, having sparred over 300 rounds and been training together for a long time, and also sharing trainers. Because there's so much intimate knowledge, I have the suspicion that familiarity will breed contempt in this instance. And I don't mean contempt as in like real proper contempt. What I mean is, because they're both familiar with each other, I don't think there'll be too much of a feeling out process in the fight. I don't think either guy will be overly cautious because they've sparred with each other so much. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be an all-out war, but when you're in there with somebody who you've never been in a ring with before, sometimes you're a little cautious and you want to just see what they have and what they're about, what they do well, what they don't do well. Whereas these fighters are very familiar with each other. So I think they're going to go in the ring with a very, very set in stone kind of game plan because they know each other so well, And I think the feeling out process may be shorter in this fight than normal. A good example of it would be when Keith Thurman fought Sean Porter. Because they'd sparred before and they were familiar with each other, it was just action from the opening bell. And again, I'm not necessarily expecting action from the opening bell from these two, although I do think it's going to be a good fight. But yeah, I reckon the feeling out process will be relatively short because there's so much familiarity there. They won't be too concerned about the other guy. So yeah, interesting fight. And this will be for the vacant IBF middleweight title. Not much in it in age. In fact, Danny Jacobs might be the same age. How old is Danny? Danny Jacobs is actually a year younger, despite the fact he's had a hell of a lot more fights and been around a hell of a lot longer as a professional. Now, Danny Jacobs is listed as 5'11 and a half here. I could have sworn that when he's fought on HBO before, they've listed him at 6'1". BoxRec doesn't always get the information correct all the time when it comes to height and reach. A lot of people don't see. A lot of people seem to think that BoxRec is the Bible. BoxRec is a fantastic website, one of my favorite websites of all time. But they're human and they do make mistakes. Okay, so don't take every bit of detail on BoxRec as gospel, particularly when it comes to things like height and reach, because they do get these things wrong, fairly frequently. Most of the time, I reckon they're accurate, but there's been many instances over the years where BoxRec have got the height and reach wrong and then you found it accurately elsewhere. But they do change height and reach. They will correct it when they realize they've got it wrong for certain fighters. But because they're covering thousands of different fighters, it's obviously difficult to get everybody right. But anyway, yeah, Danny Jacobs is definitely the taller man. He's definitely got the longer reach, whether he's 5'11 and a half or 6'1". He's definitely got much longer arms and he's much taller. But Jacobs is a guy who likes to fight. He likes to stay in the pocket and trade. One of the times when he used movement more than he typically would was against Golovkin. And you can understand that. But later on in the fight in fact, not even later on in the fight, probably after the knockdown against Golovkin, he started standing his ground more, interestingly enough. And he was standing his ground in spots against Golovkin, and then he would move a little bit. But late in the fight, he really stood his ground against Golovkin and he was, throwing some very heavy lever at him. In Jacobs' last fight against Sergiy, Jacobs to me was a little crude in that fight. He stood his ground a lot more than I would have personally advised him to do. And Sergiy was able to actually outbox Danny Jacobs for stretches in that fight. Sergiy can box. Don't get it twisted. Sergiy's a talented boxer. But I just feel like Danny Jacobs was maybe playing into his hands a little bit, but to be fair, when he did step on the gas and really try and impose his physicality on Sergiy, that's when he did have a lot more success. So maybe he just realized Sergiy was a better boxer than him, so he had to impose himself and dispense with the chess match. So it's going to be interesting to see the kind of approach he takes against Derevyanchenko. Sorry. Can be trying to mess the name up again. It's going to be interesting to see the approach he takes against Derevyanchenko, whether he wants to box, whether he wants to brawl, whether it's going to be a bit of both. I suspect it'll be a bit of both. But yeah, interesting fight. Definitely looking forward to it. Saturday, the 27th of October. So it's a long way off yet. But according to Jacobs' promoter, Eddie Hearn, Jacobs is already much lighter at this stage than he would normally be this far out from a fight. So he's taking it very, very seriously. And I guess that's testament to how good he thinks Derevyanchenko is. Because if he'd sparred him and didn't think much of him, he might not be so diligent when it comes to keeping his weight down this far out. But at the same time, as I say, I think he's going in there with a very clear strategy, and so will Derevyanchenko, to be both going in there with a very clear strategy of what they want to do. You would imagine that Derevyanchenko wants to get close to Jacobs, but I don't know. You know, he's a good boxer, good on his back foot. And if Jacobs wants to brawl and Jacobs wants to be reckless, then maybe Derevyanchenko will get on the back foot and box a little bit. We'll see. But definitely an interesting fight. Definitely a good fight. And one of the better fights that HBO are going to have on this year, at least on paper. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. How many of you are picking Derevyanchenko to beat Danny Jacobs? How many of you are picking Danny Jacobs to win the fight? And where do you see either man going? Do you think Danny Jacobs can finally get in there with the likes of Canelo, maybe Billy Joe Saunders, or the winner of Saunders Andrade, or even Golovkin, if Golovkin gets past Canelo? Do you see him having those sort of fights, and how would he do in those fights? We know that the Golovkin fight was a very good performance by Danny Jacobs. He, in the eyes of a lot of people, actually won the Golovkin fight, but, you know, some people say it's debatable. They had Golovkin winning. And what do you think of Derevyanchenko? Can he go on to be a serious force in the middleweight division? Drop your comments in the comment section below and let me know how you feel. All right, it's happening. I'm out.